June 15, 1944. The first light of dawn struggled through the dense smoke and haze over Saipan. The island's jagged cliffs and thick vegetation concealed Japanese infantry, entrenched in foxholes and reinforced positions, bracing for another day of combat. The ground vibrated subtly at first, almost as if the earth itself was warning of what was coming. Then came the roar. American artillery, positioned miles away, yet coordinated with uncanny precision, unleashed wave after wave of explosive fire that rolled across the terrain like unstoppable iron walls. Trees splintered, earth erupted in smoke and dirt, and defensive bunkers shook violently under the relentless assault. Japanese soldiers, trained to endure bombardment, stared in disbelief as their carefully prepared positions crumbled. Their rifles felt powerless in their hands, their instincts overwhelmed by the sheer scale and precision of the attack. Every explosion, every shockwave, reinforced a chilling truth. They were facing a force capable of reshaping the battlefield itself. The jungle and cliffs, once protective cover, had become a cage under the relentless domination of American firepower. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. The United States, pursuing its island-hopping strategy, aimed to capture key positions in the Mariana Islands, bringing airfields within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Saipan, with its rugged cliffs, dense jungles, and strategic location, was identified as a crucial objective. For Japanese defenders, the island represented both a barrier and a symbol. Thousands of infantry, marines, and support personnel prepared to defend every ridge and valley, fully aware that failure could open the path for American bombers to strike the home islands directly. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized concealment, fortification, and attrition. Trenches zigzagged through hillsides, caves and bunkers provided shelter from bombardment, and snipers occupied hidden vantage points. Soldiers were trained to fight to the last man, reflecting both strategic necessity and the ethos of honor deeply ingrained in their military culture. Morale was bolstered by rigid discipline, ritual preparation, and belief in the invincibility of carefully planned defensive networks. Yet, despite their preparation, Japanese forces faced an enemy increasingly adept at integrating artillery, naval gunfire, and air support into cohesive attacks that could overwhelm even the most tenacious positions. The Americans, by contrast, brought overwhelming firepower to the island. Corps-level artillery units, equipped with 155mm howitzers, 105mm guns, and long-range coastal cannons, were deployed with meticulous precision. Engineers and intelligence officers mapped terrain features, Japanese positions, and potential obstacles, allowing commanders to plan barrages with near-mathematical accuracy. Forward observers and spotters coordinated each volley, adjusting fire in real time based on visual confirmation and pre-calculated trajectories. The result was a form of bombardment that could roll forward across hills, valleys, and defensive lines, crushing fortifications and leaving Japanese positions in disarray even before American infantry advanced. The first assaults on Saipan began with intense aerial and naval bombardment. While fighter bombers and battleships softened coastal defenses, artillery units inland prepared to dominate the landscape. Japanese soldiers, trained to endure air raids and naval shelling, initially relied on the natural cover of the jungle and cliffs. They believed that terrain and fortification would shield them from even the heaviest bombardment. However, U.S. artillery was designed to neutralize these advantages. Massed fire, carefully timed and layered, created a rolling wall of destruction that moved inexorably across the battlefield. For infantry hidden in foxholes or behind trees, the earth seemed to move under their feet, and the jungle canopy shattered above them. Communication and coordination were essential on both sides. Japanese officers struggled to maintain contact under the onslaught, often resorting to runners or signal flags when radio lines were disrupted. Commanders tried to rotate units, reinforce weakened sectors, and anticipate the direction of American advance, but the scale and speed of artillery barrages made it nearly impossible to respond effectively. Conversely, U.S. commanders monitored artillery progress continuously, adjusting trajectories and fire rates to maximize pressure and minimize gaps in coverage. This synchronization of firepower with infantry movements ensured that Japanese defensive positions were constantly under threat, creating both physical and psychological strain. The psychological dimension of the battle became apparent even before the first infantry engagement. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to the intermittent shocks of artillery, were now confronted by a relentless, rolling barrage that advanced like an iron wall. The scale of fire, combined with its precision, generated disbelief and fear. Soldiers reported the ground trembling, fortifications collapsing, and the jungle itself seeming to yield to invisible forces. This shock disrupted unit cohesion, slowed decision-making, and eroded confidence in defensive plans. Civilians on Saipan, though fewer in number, also witnessed the devastation, further amplifying the sense that nothing on the island could withstand the American advance. By the time U.S. infantry landed on Saipan's beaches, artillery had already reshaped the battlefield. Defensive bunkers were demolished, foxholes partially collapsed, and once protected positions left exposed. Japanese soldiers, though trained and determined, now faced a dual challenge: survive the rolling fire and mount counterattacks under constant bombardment. The stage was set for a confrontation in which human endurance, tactical ingenuity, and psychological resilience would be tested to the utmost. The relentless power of American artillery had transformed the terrain into a theater where survival and disbelief coexisted, preparing both attackers and defenders for the defining moments to follow. As June 16th unfolded, the full scale of the American artillery assault became evident. U.S. forces had meticulously integrated firepower into every phase of the campaign. Artillery batteries, positioned on high ground and behind concealed ridges, delivered overlapping fields of fire. Each gun was assigned a sector, ensuring that Japanese positions, whether entrenched in bunkers or hidden in jungle foliage, were constantly threatened. Forward observers, stationed perilously close to the front lines, relayed corrections with urgent precision. The result was a rolling barrage that advanced with the infantry, reducing enemy defenses incrementally but consistently. Japanese commanders quickly recognized the unprecedented nature of the threat. Fortifications designed to withstand aerial bombardment were vulnerable to the methodical application of artillery. Trenches and foxholes, often dug with painstaking effort, were partially destroyed with each salvo. The earth shook under the repeated detonations, and thick smoke and flying debris obscured lines of sight. Soldiers who had trained for years to endure conventional shelling now faced a barrage that seemed alive, progressing inexorably, leaving no opportunity to regroup or counterattack. Coordination between artillery and infantry was key to American success. While guns fired relentlessly, infantry units advanced behind the rolling wall of explosions, exploiting weakened positions as soon as the smoke cleared. Engineers cleared obstacles and paths through jungle terrain, allowing tanks and additional artillery pieces to advance further inland. Logistics, often overlooked in historical accounts, were critical. Ammunition supply lines had to be maintained under fire. Crews rotated to avoid fatigue, and calculations for range, wind, and trajectory updated constantly. The sophistication of these operations reflected the evolution of warfare in the Pacific, where firepower and precision increasingly dictated the outcome of engagements. Technological advantages amplified the psychological and physical impact. U.S. artillery pieces, including 105mm howitzers and 125mm long-range guns, combined destructive capability with mobility. Spotters, equipped with binoculars and early range-finding instruments, provided real-time adjustments, ensuring shells landed precisely where intended. Explosive force traveled through earth and vegetation alike, collapsing fortifications and breaking the will of defenders. The technology of war, coupled with tactical innovation, allowed the Americans to dominate terrain once thought naturally defensible. For Japanese infantry, the consequences were immediate and disorienting. The rolling barrage created a sense of inevitability. No trench, bunker, or natural barrier could stop the advancing destruction. Soldiers reported difficulty hearing commands over the roar of gunfire, maintaining positions under repeated tremors, and staying oriented amid rising smoke and dust. Coordination among units became nearly impossible, as officers struggled to maintain communication and morale. Many experienced a creeping disbelief. The Americans were not merely firing shells, they were reshaping the battlefield with deliberate precision. The psychological dimension extended beyond fear. The constant bombardment disrupted sleep, sapped energy, and eroded confidence in leadership. Units that might have mounted counterattacks hesitated, unsure if reinforcements could survive or if positions would remain intact. Civilians, though small in number, experienced the collapse of the familiar landscape, reinforcing the perception of American dominance. Japanese defensive doctrine, long reliant on discipline, terrain, and attrition, faced a challenge it had never fully anticipated. By nightfall, the battlefield bore the unmistakable imprint of American artillery. Bunkers partially demolished, foxholes flattened, and the terrain scarred, Japanese units were forced to adapt or face annihilation. The rolling barrage had transformed static defenses into fluid zones of vulnerability, eroding both physical fortifications and the mental resilience of soldiers. From this foundation, the stage was set for the next phase of the battle, the human, tactical, and technological angles that would culminate in the full realization of artillery's devastating effect, leaving Japanese infantry awed, shaken, and unprepared for the relentless force advancing toward them. For Japanese infantry, the reality of American artillery on Saipan was more than a tactical challenge. It was a profound psychological shock. Soldiers, trained to endure bombardments and jungle skirmishes, found themselves under a relentless barrage that reshaped both landscape and perception. Each detonation sent tremors through the ground, shook trees to their roots, and created deafening echoes that left ears ringing long after the explosions had ended. Foxholes collapsed, bunkers splintered, and even the thickest earthworks offered only partial protection. The human response varied. Some clutched their rifles in disbelief, scanning the tree line for targets that could not be engaged, while others crouched silently, attempting to endure the roar and hope for survival. Fatigue, fear, and disbelief compounded as hours passed, eroding cohesion within units and leaving even veteran soldiers uncertain of what lay beyond the smoke. The constant threat of artillery created a mental strain as severe as any physical injury. Soldiers feared not only the immediate explosions, but also the invisible progression of fire. The rolling nature of the barrage meant that nowhere was truly safe. Positions vacated or weakened would be targeted next. Panic, though often suppressed in military training, crept into small units. Many recounted the surreal experience of watching earth and jungle tremble under attacks that seemed unstoppable, giving rise to a sense that survival depended less on skill than on fortune. American artillery operations were meticulously planned to exploit terrain and maximize impact. Fire was synchronized to create overlapping zones of destruction, leaving Japanese defenders constantly exposed. Batteries were positioned to cover valleys, ridges, and natural choke points, ensuring that any movement could be immediately targeted. Forward observers adjusted fire in real time, coordinating multiple guns to strike simultaneously. The effect was not merely physical, it forced Japanese units to rethink defensive strategies. Trenches that had once been effective became traps, and familiar terrain offered little advantage. Japanese commanders attempted countermeasures, rotating troops, reinforcing positions, and issuing new defensive orders. However, The relentless coordination of American firepower limited their options. Any attempt to move or regroup risked exposure, and communication lines were frequently disrupted by the shock and debris of repeated explosions. The tactical superiority of American artillery lay not only in raw power, but in the seamless integration of planning, observation, and execution, a lesson painfully evident to defenders who had relied on static fortifications and entrenched positions. U.S. artillery technology amplified both the physical and psychological effects. Howitzers and long-range guns, paired with advanced range-finding instruments, allowed for precise targeting at distances previously considered impractical. Explosive shells delivered massive concussive force, capable of collapsing bunkers and disrupting unit formations. Mobility of artillery units enabled repositioning to maintain pressure, ensuring that Japanese positions were continuously threatened. Spotters equipped with binoculars and communication tools relayed real-time adjustments, creating a feedback loop that maximized efficiency. For Japanese soldiers, the visible destruction was only part of the terror. The knowledge that every movement could be tracked and targeted compounded feelings of vulnerability. American commanders leveraged artillery not merely as destructive force but as a tool of operational dominance. Planning involved detailed maps, calculations of terrain, wind and shell trajectories, and precise timing to coordinate with infantry advances. Leadership focused on synchronization, ensuring that artillery neutralized obstacles ahead of the front line and maintained constant pressure. Japanese officers, by contrast, faced the dual challenge of protecting troops and adapting doctrine in real time under unprecedented bombardment. Decisions were forced under duress, with limited information and near-constant threat of incoming fire. The clash of command philosophies highlighted the decisive role of leadership in shaping battlefield outcomes. From the perspective of Japanese defenders, the sheer scale and precision of American artillery were incomprehensible. Soldiers who had prepared for conventional bombardment were confronted with firepower that advanced like a living entity, crushing terrain, morale, and cohesion simultaneously. Communication failures, disrupted logistics, and physical devastation amplified the sense of helplessness. The psychological dominance of U.S. artillery forced a reconsideration of defensive strategies, emphasizing survival over counterattack. Even well-trained units were unprepared for the intensity and relentlessness of a barrage that moved systematically across the battlefield. American artillery on Saipan represented the culmination of years of engineering refinement. Guns like the 155 mm Long Tom and the 105 mm howitzers combined firepower with precision, mobility, and range. Engineers had calculated trajectories to account for wind, humidity, and uneven terrain, ensuring that shells struck exactly where intended. Forward observers, positioned dangerously close to Japanese lines, relayed real-time corrections via radio, adjusting for misfires, drift, and moving targets. For Japanese infantry, the experience was disorienting. Explosions arrived not in random intervals, as in typical bombardments, but in a deliberate, controlled pattern that seemed to advance like a wall across the island. Even natural terrain features, hills, cliffs, dense jungle, offered minimal protection. The battlefield had been transformed into a meticulously mapped grid where every position could be targeted, leaving defenders constantly on edge. The impact of this precision went beyond destruction. Japanese soldiers, trained in resilience and endurance, faced a type of warfare that targeted perception itself. Every rumble beneath the feet, every splintered tree, every cratered foxhole reinforced the sense of inevitability. Fear spread silently but efficiently. Small units hesitated to advance, relay messages were delayed, and coordination broke down. Officers struggled to maintain order while under relentless bombardment. Soldiers recounted a creeping disbelief, the feeling that no matter how well they held their positions, the Americans would methodically crush every obstacle in their path. Psychological endurance, normally a source of strength in Japanese doctrine, now became a limiting factor, undermined by the relentless and precise application of firepower. American forces integrated artillery with infantry and engineers, creating a fluid system of combined arms. Forward units capitalized on the rolling barrage, advancing as shells neutralized enemy positions. Engineers cleared paths through debris and jungle obstacles, while artillery units adjusted fire to remove new fortifications erected by Japanese defenders. The synergy of these elements created a relentless pressure that Japanese forces struggled to counter. Traditional tactics, camouflage, entrenchment, and layered defense were increasingly ineffective. Positions that had been thought secure were exposed by careful coordination, and any attempt to maneuver risked destruction. The combination of firepower, precision, and timing forced Japanese commanders into reactive strategies, continually responding to American initiatives rather than dictating their own. Leadership under these conditions was a decisive factor. U.S. commanders meticulously planned artillery barrages, accounting for terrain, Japanese fortifications, and potential counterattacks. Orders were executed with strict discipline, timing coordinated to support advancing infantry while maintaining continuous pressure on enemy positions. Japanese officers, facing an unprecedented operational tempo, struggled to maintain control. Communication lines were severed by explosions, forward units isolated, and the chain of command strained. Decisions that would normally allow for counterattacks or tactical withdrawals were made under extreme duress, with uncertainty about enemy strength and positioning. This contrast in leadership effectiveness highlighted the role of preparation, discipline, and adaptability in determining battlefield outcomes. From the viewpoint of Japanese defenders, the artillery was incomprehensible in both scale and efficiency. Soldiers reported a feeling that the land itself was moving against them, reshaping defensive lines before they could respond. The relentless, coordinated barrage undermined morale, eroded cohesion, and forced continuous adaptation. Every shell that landed reinforced the dominance of American forces, creating a sense of inevitability and helplessness. Strategically, the psychological impact of artillery extended beyond immediate casualties. It dictated where Japanese troops could safely occupy, influenced the timing of counterattacks, and shaped both defensive and logistical planning. The Americans had demonstrated that mastery of firepower, combined with observation and coordination, could dominate the battlefield in ways that defied conventional expectations. Through technological sophistication, psychological pressure, tactical integration, effective leadership, and enemy response, the effectiveness of American artillery became undeniable. Japanese infantry faced not only destruction, but the constant realization that the battlefield itself had been transformed into an instrument of American strategy. Each perspective, human, tactical, technological, and command, reveals the multifaceted impact of rolling, coordinated barrages on Saipan. Soldiers endured fear and disbelief. Commanders struggled to maintain control. Terrain and fortifications were neutralized systematically. The angles converged to demonstrate that artillery was not merely a tool of war, but a decisive force capable of shaping outcomes before infantry even engaged. This relentless combination of factors set the stage for the full-scale climax, when Japanese defenses would be overwhelmed and the true power of America's rolling iron walls would be realized. June 16, 1944, dawned with an eerie stillness across Saipan. The Japanese infantry dug deep into foxholes and reinforced bunkers along the jagged ridges, braced for the day ahead. The island had been quiet through the early hours, the only sounds the distant cries of birds and the faint rustle of jungle leaves. But beneath that calm, the earth began to hum, a low vibration that grew steadily, almost imperceptibly at first. Then came the first deafening detonations. American artillery, positioned miles from the front lines, unleashed a coordinated barrage that rolled across valleys, ridges, and entrenched positions like an unstoppable iron wall. Soldiers reacted instinctively, gripping rifles, clutching helmets, and pressing themselves against the earth as shock waves shattered trees and crumbled fortifications. The jungle canopy exploded in flashes of fire and smoke. Every foxhole trembled, and dirt and debris rained down from above. For the Japanese infantry, trained to endure bombardments, the scale and precision of the assault was surreal. Explosions did not strike randomly. They advanced methodically, clearing paths ahead of approaching infantry. The roar of artillery reverberated across hillsides, disorienting defenders and forcing them into reactive movements rather than coordinated resistance. Forward positions were decimated within minutes. Machine gun nests that had been carefully sited to cover approaches were reduced to rubble. Trenches, dug with painstaking effort, collapsed under repeated shelling. Soldiers attempting to relay commands found voices drowned by the relentless cacophony. Panic and disbelief mingled with adrenaline, eroding unit cohesion. Some men froze, unable to act, while others attempted desperate repositioning, only to find their intended cover obliterated by precise follow-up rounds. The rolling barrage forced Japanese units to confront a grim reality. Survival depended not on strategy alone, but on the cruel timing and reach of American firepower. Each new volley pushed further inland, flattening defensive lines and creating open fields where soldiers had once felt secure. Leaders attempted to adjust troop formations and reinforce critical points, yet the speed and precision of artillery prevented meaningful coordination. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers recounted the sensation of earth and jungle itself moving under the onslaught, an unyielding wall advancing toward them with terrifying inevitability. American observers noted the efficacy of the operation. Forward spotters relayed impact coordinates, correcting fire to ensure overlapping coverage and minimize gaps. Artillery crews worked with exacting precision, recalculating trajectories to account for terrain, wind, and shifting positions. The combination of firepower and observation transformed static bunkers and entrenched positions into virtual open fields. Every defensive tactic employed by the Japanese, from camouflaged foxholes to fortified caves, was systematically neutralized. The battlefield, once predictable to defenders, became a dynamic zone where no position could guarantee safety. By mid-morning, casualties began to mount, though the human toll was only one measure of success. The rolling barrage had inflicted structural devastation across key defensive areas. Observation posts were destroyed, communication lines severed, and artillery coordination among Japanese units disrupted. Even experienced officers admitted in reports that their ability to command under such conditions was severely hampered. The relentless pressure forced them into reactive decisions, leaving little room for strategic initiative. The terrain itself bore witness to the power of coordinated artillery. Hillsides were scarred, trenches filled with debris, and the jungle canopy fractured by repeated explosions. Smoke and dust obscured movement, and the pervasive sound of detonations created constant tension. Every Japanese soldier faced the dual challenge of surviving physical destruction while processing the psychological weight of the bombardment. The sensation of advancing iron walls, unrelenting, precise, and overwhelming, left many questioning how, if at all, their defensive efforts could succeed. Amid this chaos, individual acts of bravery and desperation emerged. Soldiers attempted to rally comrades, carry wounded to safer positions, and return fire when possible. Yet the magnitude of the barrage made such efforts almost futile. Infantry movements were constantly interrupted, and every attempt to regroup was met with renewed artillery fire. The scale and coordination of American firepower demonstrated that victory could be achieved before direct engagement, with precision, planning, and discipline dictating outcomes on the battlefield. As the morning progressed, Japanese defenders were forced into fragmented resistance. Units became isolated, Officers struggled to issue orders, and the rolling iron wall of artillery continued its inexorable advance. The cumulative effect was both physical and psychological. Positions were shattered, morale eroded, and disbelief spread among the ranks. The battlefield had been transformed into a landscape where survival was dictated as much by the mastery of firepower as by individual skill or courage. The stage was now set for the next phase of the climax. Japanese defenses, fractured and demoralized, faced continued artillery onslaught paired with advancing infantry, tanks, and engineers. The effectiveness of rolling barrages would soon demonstrate their full potential, not merely as a destructive force, but as an instrument that could break even the most determined defenders, leaving awe, fear, and irrevocable change in its wake. By early afternoon on June 16, 1944, the full force of the American artillery assault had reshaped the battlefield. Japanese infantry, already disoriented from the morning's rolling barrage, faced renewed explosions that advanced like an iron tide across ridges and valleys. Foxholes that had survived initial volleys collapsed under repeated shelling. Fortified bunkers, once considered impregnable, were reduced to rubble. The psychological impact matched the physical devastation. Soldiers struggled to comprehend the relentless precision of fire. It was no longer random destruction. Each blast was part of a systematic advance that seemed unstoppable. Japanese officers attempted desperate countermeasures. Reinforcements were rushed to threatened sectors, machine gun nests repositioned, and artillery crews called upon to return fire. Yet communication lines were fragmented. Runners struggled through craters and debris, and radio transmissions were frequently cut off by explosions. Units became isolated, forcing lower-level officers and sergeants to make decisions under extreme pressure. Despite courage and training, coordination faltered. Soldiers reported a sensation of inevitability. The relentless iron wall of fire was closing in, and no position felt safe. The physical devastation was staggering. Trees were splintered, earth was churned into craters, and smoke filled every valley, obscuring visibility. Explosions occurred in near-continuous succession, creating a deafening cacophony that drowned out commands and even the natural sounds of the jungle. Infantry movements were constantly interrupted, and any attempt to regroup was met with renewed precision fire. Observation posts were destroyed, cutting off the Japanese command from vital information, while key positions along ridgelines and choke points were obliterated. The battlefield itself had become an instrument of American strategy, dictating where soldiers could and could not survive. American artillery crews, observing the effect, adjusted fire in real time to exploit weaknesses. Forward spotters communicated precise corrections, ensuring every salvo maintained momentum. Mobility of artillery units allowed repositioning to cover flanks and neutralize newly established defenses. The combination of firepower, observation, and mobility created a continuous pressure that left Japanese infantry reacting rather than initiating. Even small units, trained to hold positions under extreme duress, were gradually overwhelmed. Survival depended on chance as much as skill or discipline. The human toll, though only partially recorded in the chaos of battle, was immense. Soldiers were physically injured by debris and shockwaves. Many were psychologically strained by the relentless barrage. Exhaustion, fear, and disbelief combined to break unit cohesion. Men who had trained for years in jungle warfare found their strategies ineffective against the systematic, rolling application of firepower. Individual acts of bravery occurred. Soldiers carried wounded comrades, attempted to return fire, and tried to reinforce crumbling positions, but they were often insufficient against the coordinated destruction descending upon them. The combination of artillery and infantry coordination soon became decisive. As the rolling barrage weakened positions, American infantry advanced behind the curtain of explosions, exploiting gaps and neutralizing remaining resistance. Engineers cleared debris and obstacles, allowing tanks and support units to move forward and reinforce success. Japanese defenders found that even counterattacks were met with overwhelming firepower, leaving little room for initiative. The rolling iron wall had transformed from a physical threat into a strategic instrument that dictated the pace and outcome of engagement. By late afternoon, Japanese defensive lines were shattered. What had begun as organized resistance devolved into fragmented pockets of soldiers attempting to survive. Leadership was disrupted, positions were destroyed, and the psychological dominance of American artillery had reached its peak. Soldiers described the surreal sensation of the jungle itself being reshaped, of earth and foliage yielding to a force beyond comprehension. The battlefield, once familiar and navigable, had become an alien terrain defined by explosions, craters, and smoke. The climax of Saipan's artillery campaign demonstrated both physical and psychological mastery. Destruction alone was not the objective. The combination of precision, coordination, and relentless pressure had ensured that Japanese defenses were systematically neutralized. The rolling barrage, like an unstoppable wall of iron, reshaped both terrain and morale. Soldiers and officers alike faced the realization that even the most disciplined and fortified positions could not withstand sustained, coordinated firepower. As twilight approached, the echoes of explosions gradually diminished, leaving the island scarred and Japanese infantry decimated. Survivors regrouped in isolated pockets, shaken, disoriented, and acutely aware of the overwhelming capability of American artillery. The stage was now set for the aftermath. The consequences of this unprecedented display of firepower, measured not only in casualties and destruction, but in the irreversible psychological and strategic shift on Saipan's battlefield. The immediate aftermath of the artillery onslaught revealed the full magnitude of its impact. Japanese defensive lines, meticulously prepared over months, lay shattered across Saipan's rugged terrain. Foxholes had collapsed, bunkers were reduced to rubble, and entrenched machine gun positions had been neutralized. The physical devastation was apparent to both attackers and survivors. Yet, beyond measurable damage, the psychological consequences were equally profound. Soldiers who had faced earlier bombardments with stoicism now confronted a force that seemed inexorable, precise, and intelligent. Disbelief and fear spread as widely as the craters and broken trees that scarred the island. Civilians, though limited in number, experienced the impact firsthand. Smoke and dust choked villages and farmsteads. Families huddled in caves or makeshift shelters, witnessing their surroundings torn apart without warning. Even those removed from the front line were forced to reckon with the overwhelming reach of American firepower. Reports circulated among the populace of entire ridges obliterated, artillery advancing like a wall that reshaped the land itself. For many, the devastation instilled both awe and dread, a clear demonstration that warfare extended beyond immediate combat into the very perception of safety and survival. For Japanese commanders, the aftermath was a mixture of shock, frustration, and grim calculation. The meticulously planned network of defenses had been rendered largely ineffective by coordinated artillery fire. Officers struggled to regroup fragmented units, re-establish communication, and reinforce critical sectors. Reports described disorientation among troops. Men were exhausted, morale eroded, and the sense of inevitability from the rolling barrage left little room for decisive countermeasures. Even experienced veterans acknowledged that traditional defensive doctrine had been insufficient to withstand the precision and intensity of American firepower. The American perspective reinforced the success of the operation. Observers noted the effectiveness of synchronized barrages combined with infantry advance. Artillery units had achieved maximum impact without the need for reckless frontal assaults, conserving manpower while systematically dismantling enemy defenses. Engineers and forward units exploited every breach, securing strategic terrain and enabling subsequent operations to proceed with reduced resistance. The operation demonstrated that mastery of firepower, observation, and coordination could achieve both tactical and psychological dominance. Reshaping the battlefield before direct infantry engagement became necessary. The cumulative effect of the barrage became evident in unit cohesion. Japanese forces, once disciplined and coordinated, were now fractured into isolated pockets. Communication breakdowns and the destruction of command posts left lower-level officers making critical decisions under extreme pressure. Attempts to consolidate positions were frequently met with renewed artillery fire, preventing any meaningful reorganization. Soldiers recounted the surreal experience of navigating terrain that seemed to shift beneath them, as though the battlefield itself was actively resisting their presence. Fear, exhaustion, and disbelief compounded the challenge of survival, creating a psychological toll as devastating as any physical injury. Strategically, the aftermath of the rolling barrage forced a re-evaluation of Japanese defensive planning. Commanders recognized that even fortified positions could be neutralized systematically without infantry engagement. The psychological impact of relentless, coordinated fire undermined confidence in leadership and doctrine. Civilians and soldiers alike were forced to reconcile with the reality that the Americans had achieved dominance not merely through brute force, but through precision, planning, and the integration of technology and tactics. By nightfall, the battlefield was scarred and quiet, yet the imprint of destruction and fear remained. Survivors huddled in what remained of defensive positions, acutely aware that the next wave of attacks could arrive at any moment. Trees were splintered, earth churned into craters, and bunkers lay in ruin. The Americans had demonstrated a new dimension of warfare, the ability to reshape both land and perception simultaneously. For Japanese infantry, the experience would leave a lasting impression, shaping their response in subsequent battles and reinforcing the overwhelming effectiveness of coordinated artillery as a tool of war. The stage was now set for the continuation of Saipan's aftermath. The broader consequences of American firepower, measured not only in destruction but in the psychological, strategic, and operational shifts it created for Japanese forces and the wider Pacific campaign. In the days following the initial bombardment, the full consequences of American artillery on Saipan became increasingly evident. Japanese defensive positions remained fragmented, with entire ridges and valleys cleared of organized resistance. Survivors attempted to regroup, but the psychological and physical toll of the rolling barrage had left units disoriented and exhausted. Morale, already strained by the broader context of the Pacific campaign, was further eroded. Soldiers confronted a chilling reality. Even the most fortified positions offered limited protection against a foe capable of precise, relentless fire. The destruction extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese supply lines, communication networks, and logistical hubs had been disrupted by targeted shelling, complicating efforts to reinforce or evacuate positions. Bunkers, observation posts, and field hospitals suffered damage or complete collapse, forcing commanders to improvise under extreme pressure. These disruptions amplified confusion and hampered counterattack planning. Reports from surviving officers highlighted both the ingenuity and desperation required to maintain cohesion amidst the relentless pressure of American firepower. The human cost, though not fully documented, was significant. Casualties mounted not only from direct hits, but also from debris, shock waves, and secondary explosions. Survivors described the psychological weight of the barrage. Every tremor of the ground, every shattering tree, reinforced the inevitability of defeat. Soldiers attempted to maintain discipline, but fear and exhaustion often overpowered training. Even acts of courage, rescuing wounded comrades or attempting to hold strategic positions, were undermined by the unyielding advance of artillery and accompanying infantry movements. For American forces, The aftermath confirmed the effectiveness of integrating artillery with combined arms operations. Forward observers continued to adjust fire, ensuring that even residual Japanese positions were neutralized. Infantry followed systematically behind the rolling barrages, exploiting gaps and securing key terrain with minimal resistance. Engineers cleared paths for advancing tanks and artillery units, reinforcing momentum and reducing the risk of counterattacks. The operation demonstrated that dominance could be achieved without reckless frontal assaults, combining precision, planning, and psychological pressure to achieve strategic objectives. Strategically, the impact of the bombardment extended beyond Saipan. Japanese commanders were forced to reconsider defensive doctrine across the Pacific. Positions that had once been deemed secure now required reconsideration of terrain, fortification methods, and troop deployment. The realization that artillery could dominate a battlefield before direct engagement challenged traditional assumptions, compelling a re-evaluation of both tactical and operational planning. Civilians, observing the destruction, also faced heightened anxiety, adding a further layer to the psychological consequences of the campaign. The rolling barrage's legacy extended to the individual soldier's experience. Those who survived the initial assault faced days of constant vigilance, aware that positions could be targeted at any moment. Training and discipline were tested to the limits, while psychological resilience became as critical as physical endurance. Letters and diaries from survivors conveyed disbelief, exhaustion, and a grudging respect for the precision and coordination of American forces. Even those committed to resisting to the last man were forced to confront the overwhelming efficacy of well-planned, meticulously executed artillery fire. By the end of the first week, Japanese defensive cohesion had been effectively dismantled. Isolated pockets of resistance persisted, but these were sporadic and largely ineffective. American control of key terrain enabled continued advances, securing airfields and observation posts critical to the broader Pacific campaign. The integration of artillery with infantry and engineers had not only inflicted physical destruction, but had established a psychological dominance that would influence Japanese responses in subsequent battles. The aftermath of Saipan's artillery campaign illustrates the dual nature of modern warfare. The HDD combination of physical devastation and psychological influence. American forces had demonstrated that mastery of firepower, observation, and coordination could reshape terrain, disrupt enemy cohesion, and dominate the battlefield before direct combat fully commenced. Japanese infantry, facing overwhelming odds, endured both destruction and disbelief, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Pacific warfare. In the days following the initial bombardment, the full consequences of American artillery on Saipan became increasingly evident. Japanese defensive positions remained fragmented, with entire ridges and valleys cleared of organized resistance. Survivors attempted to regroup, but the psychological and physical toll of the rolling barrage had left units disoriented and exhausted. Morale, already strained by the broader context of the Pacific campaign, was further eroded. Soldiers confronted a chilling reality. Even the most fortified positions offered limited protection against a foe capable of precise, relentless fire. The destruction extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese supply lines, communication networks, and logistical hubs had been disrupted by targeted shelling, complicating efforts to reinforce or evacuate positions. Bunkers, observation posts, and field hospitals suffered damage or complete collapse, forcing commanders to improvise under extreme pressure. These disruptions amplified confusion and hampered counterattack planning. Reports from surviving officers highlighted both the ingenuity and desperation required to maintain cohesion amidst the relentless pressure of American firepower. The human cost, though not fully documented, was significant. Casualties mounted not only from direct hits, but also from debris, shockwaves, and secondary explosions. Survivors described the psychological weight of the barrage. Every tremor of the ground, every shattering tree, reinforced the inevitability of defeat. Soldiers attempted to maintain discipline, but fear and exhaustion often overpowered training. Even acts of courage, rescuing wounded comrades or attempting to hold strategic positions, were undermined by the unyielding advance of artillery and accompanying infantry movements. For American forces, the aftermath confirmed the effectiveness of integrating artillery with combined arms operations. Forward observers continued to adjust fire, ensuring that even residual Japanese positions were neutralized. Infantry followed systematically behind the rolling barrages, exploiting gaps and securing key terrain with minimal resistance. Engineers cleared paths for advancing tanks and artillery units, reinforcing momentum and reducing the risk of counterattacks. The operation demonstrated that dominance could be achieved without reckless frontal assaults, combining precision, planning, and psychological pressure to achieve strategic objectives. Strategically, the impact of the bombardment extended beyond Saipan. Japanese commanders were forced to reconsider defensive doctrine across the Pacific. Positions that had once been deemed secure now required reconsideration of terrain, fortification methods, and troop deployment. The realization that artillery could dominate a battlefield before direct engagement challenged traditional assumptions, compelling a re-evaluation of both tactical and operational planning. Civilians, observing the destruction, also faced heightened anxiety, adding a further layer to the psychological consequences of the campaign. The rolling barrage's legacy extended to the individual soldier's experience. Those who survived the initial assault faced days of constant vigilance, aware that positions could be targeted at any moment. Training and discipline were tested to the limits, while psychological resilience became as critical as physical endurance. Letters and diaries from survivors conveyed disbelief, exhaustion, and a grudging respect for the precision and coordination of American forces. Even those committed to resisting to the last man were forced to confront the overwhelming efficacy of well-planned, meticulously executed artillery fire. By the end of the first week, Japanese defensive cohesion had been effectively dismantled. Isolated pockets of resistance persisted, but these were sporadic and largely ineffective. American control of key terrain enabled continued advances, securing airfields and observation posts critical to the broader Pacific campaign. The integration of artillery with infantry and engineers had not only inflicted physical destruction, but had established a psychological dominance that would influence Japanese responses in subsequent battles. The aftermath of Saipan's artillery campaign illustrates the dual nature of modern warfare. The HDD, combination of physical devastation and psychological influence. American forces had demonstrated that mastery of firepower, observation, and coordination could reshape terrain, disrupt enemy cohesion, and dominate the battlefield before direct combat fully commenced. Japanese infantry, facing overwhelming odds, endured both destruction and disbelief, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Pacific warfare.